All right, I think I will start. It is 1:32. Thank you for joining this webinar today. This is the first webinar of the Woodland Owner Webinar Series hosted by My St. Croix Woods, which is a program of the St. Croix River Association. My name is Nikki Hanger, and I am the Forestry Program Coordinator. The My St. Croix Woods program is a partnership of multiple public and private organizations throughout the watershed whose goal is to provide landowners with the resources and tools to make the best decisions of their land. And I just wanted to check, can everyone hear me? You can just say in the chat if you can hear me or not. Yes or no? All right, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. All right, and so before we begin the webinar, I would like to take a few moments to talk about the Zoom software. Please leave your camera off and remain on mute for the entire webinar. You can type your questions in the chat at the bottom of the screen. Just click on that and it should pop up. We will answer questions after the presentation, but feel free to type them throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent out in the next few days. So if you do have internet issues, you can still watch at a later date. I also want to thank you in advance for being patient with us while this is the first time I have done this style of webinar. Okay. Today's topic will be about how to enroll in Minnesota's Sustainable Forest Incentive Act, also known as SFIA. Our presenters are from the Minnesota Department of Revenue and will be guiding us on how to enroll in SFIA. They have years of experience with the SFIA process. I actually heard them present a few months ago and thought they did an amazing job, so I'm really glad they're here with us today. Also on the line is John Carlson and Andy McGuire from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. They are state foresters and will be available at the Q&A session for forestry or DNR specific questions. Before I hand off the controls, I would like to ask a simple poll question. It should pop up for you to answer. Let me get that up right now. All right, and I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer that. Okay, it looks like the polls are slowing down. And then I can share the results. So it seems like a lot of you have never heard of the program or heard of the name, but don't know much about it. So I'll share you guys the results so you can kind of see that. All right. So without further ado, I will hand over controls to Jesse, Emily, and Julie from the Minnesota Department of Revenue. And then if you could take yourself off mute, Jesse, Emily, and Julie.
Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Anderson. I'm going to let Jesse do the screen sharing. I first of all just want to thank Nicole for inviting us to present today and with all of you just to share a little bit about the Sustainable Forest Incentive Act program. Like she said, we had the opportunity back in March, which right now seems like a lifetime ago, to present with DNR to a larger group of forest plan writers, which is where she saw our presentation. With that presentation and now this one, we are just excited to be doing our part in getting more awareness and knowledge of the program and explaining what Revenue's role is in the program so it can benefit the forest industry. We are typically out presenting to county assessors and educating them on how they can communicate with all of you as property owners as far as what your options are. So being able to speak directly to you and with you is something that we're really excited about. So we just really hope that you learn something new and get any questions that you may have answered throughout our presentation. So before I get started going into the details of the program itself, I just want to introduce myself and the two others I have joining with me. So like I said, my name is Emily Anderson and I am a supervisor at the Department of Revenue. I've been with the department for over 10 years now and have had the pleasure of working with the SFIA program for over 4 of them. So what seems like a short amount of time, we've had a lot of legislative changes during that time. So it is kind of a trial by error, and here we go, learning the program and educating all of you. So I'm excited to be here. I am going to also let Jessie Clancy and Julie Rosales introduce themselves. So Julie, why don't you unmute and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Hello, I'm Julie Rosales. I'm at the Department of Revenue, and I administered the program on the revenue side of the program. I've been part of the program since the beginning, which was in 2002, and we've had many changes in the program and many people involved in the program too. I think I'm the only person from the beginning that is still hanging around with this program. So that being said, I will pass the torch on to Jessie.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessie Clancy. I have been with the department and the property tax division for 10 years. My primary role is education and outreach. I spend a lot of time with county assessors, educating them on all things property tax, including programs such as SFIA. We're really excited to be here today on this webinar, and we hope we can teach you something. I will hand it back to Emily.
All right, great, thank you. I am excited for you to hear from them later. They have a great deal of knowledge to share with all of you. Okay, so let's get started with simply what is the Sustainable Forest Incentive Act, which, as Nikki had said, we've referred to as SFIA. Well, it's a statewide program meant to promote sustainable forest resource management on the state's private forest land. And they do so by encouraging forest landowners to make a long-term commitment to sustainable forest management. A way that we do this through the program is an incentive, is the program provides an incentive payment for enrolled landowners to practice this long-term forest management. So who is eligible for the program? Really any landowners who have qualifying forest land are eligible, and they have the option to enroll in the program. We will go into details of what qualifying lands consist of in just a little bit. And so then once the land is enrolled and a certification is made, then landowners will receive payment for each acre of qualifying forest land. So that means that payments are on a per acre basis. As I mentioned, once enrolled, landowners agree to not develop the land and abide by a covenant that's in place on their property, and also follow a forest management plan. Okay, so how does it work and how can someone get started? Here is a brief overview. So property owners begin the process by recording a covenant. A covenant is a set of obligations or also requirements placed on the land. These covenants, for your reference, are found on our website under the How Do I Enroll portion of our website. And so once those covenants are filled out, they need to be recorded at the county's recorder's office in the county that the land is located in. Something else that needs to be completed is to have a forest management plan developed by an approved SFIA forester. Once this is done, it needs to be also registered with the Department of Natural Resources to make sure that step is completed as well. Something we also recommend as well, and maybe even before those first 2 things that I mentioned, is verifying the land classification of your property with the county assessor's office. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate classification, which is qualifying land to be enrolled into the program before you go through all the steps that are needed. Jessie will talk a little bit about the assessment process and setting a classification of land and what that means and the important role it plays on whether or not land qualifies for SFA. So she'll do that a little bit later in the presentation. So once those things are done, an application needs to be submitted to the Department of Revenue. That needs to include all required documents. The application is reviewed, and if approved, the property is then enrolled into the program. Then the following year and every year after, the property owner will certify that all the requirements of the program continue to be met. And then the landowner will then receive the incentive payment. So speaking of payments, this is the current payment structure for the 2020 payments. This is also found on our website. We calculate each year what those payment rates are going to be with a combination of the average of what the value of 2C property and what the taxes that are paid on 2C property, and that's how we calculate the payment. So before the law change that happened in 2017, for 10 years prior, the payment rate was just a very simple flat payment of $7 per acre. Now, as you can see, there are multiple different payment rates and different options for a property owner to enroll in, because the payment that you're receiving really depends on the length of covenant and the total number of acres that you're choosing to enroll into SFA. There are even actually a few payment rates for different circumstances that aren't listed here, such as if land is enrolled in a conservation easement, then a reduced payment would be applied to that. Or if land was enrolled prior to 2017 and in a conservation easement, that is also a different $7 payment that we talked about. But the basic and most typical scenarios that we see are on the screen right now. So like I said, as you can see, there are multiple different covenant lengths between 8, 20, and 50 year, and we'll go ahead and go into that as well. So what does qualifying land mean? Here are a few of the qualifications that must be met to be approved for the SFA program and in turn receive that incentive payment. You must be current on property taxes. You cannot have delinquent taxes on your property. And then they must have 20 acres or more of contiguous forest land, have a forest management plan in place, which as a reminder needs to be registered with the Department of Natural Resources prior to making application, and have an agreement, which is that covenant that I talked about that's limiting the property to use of forest management activities. Basically, that covenant is a promise by the landowner that the land is not and will not be used or developed in violations of the provisions of the Forest Management Plan or SFA program. This covenant is what I mentioned earlier that needs to be recorded with the county recorder's office before making application. This is what the property owner is going to make a decision of whether they want to put an 8, a 20, or a 50-year covenant on their property. The payments with each covenant go up in amounts, and the covenant runs with the land. So that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing which covenant is best fit for you. Any new owners, whether it's by either you sell your land and then you purchase owners, or maybe it's an inheritance, they must abide by that covenant as well. So just by a transfer of ownership does not remove the program or that covenant on the property. And then that new owner may apply for inclusion into the SFA program as well to receive that incentive payment. So something to keep in mind, that once the covenant is placed on the property and is enrolled into the SFA program, the property owner must agree to be enrolled into the program for a minimum of that full length of their covenant. So whether it's the 8, 20, or 50. The covenant does not expire at the end of those months. We've had cases where people have been into the program for 8 years and they thought the covenant would just expire at that time, and that is not the case. The property owner must request to be removed from the program. So after half of the covenant length has passed, so for example, in an 8-year covenant length, after 4 years has passed, the property owner may ask to withdraw from the program. And this is done through a withdrawal application, which is found on our website, on Revenue's website. And it can also, let's see, there is a waiting period, so that 4 years, in the case of an 8-year, is the waiting period between when the a claimant would request termination and then when the termination of the program actually takes place. And so that's how we get to the complete 8-year covenant length. So just for example, if someone places it into an 8-year covenant and they've served 6 years, they request to get out, it's going to still be a continued 4-year waiting period. Okay, with all the logistics, I just like to tell everybody the difference of what those covenant lengths mean. But so when you're making those decisions, keep those in mind. But I want to get back to how then to apply once you've made that decision. So once you record that covenant and your forest management plan is completed and registered with the Department of Natural Resources, the last step is to submit an application to Revenue. This is the step to get you into the program. We've had situations who they've taken those first steps, but then to forget to make that final application. In order to get you into the program and enrolled, to see if you qualify, that final step needs to be taken. And so those applications are due by October 31st. The program is co-administered with Revenue and DNR. So I'm excited that John and Andy are joining us today for any questions that maybe come up for them, because they are involved in the reviewing and approving of those applications as well. Typically, our busy time between seeing a lot of applications is between September and October, which is interesting because that is actually a busy time of year for us as well, because we are prepping a lot of the current participants in the program to receive their payments by October 1st as well. Okay, so when a landowner is ready to apply, there is actually a helpful enrollment checklist that can be found at the top of the SFAA application itself. These include some of the things that I've covered already and a few others. The next couple items you'll see on the screen are taken directly from the application itself, so it's a good resource. So as a reminder, the covenant needs to be recorded prior to October 31st with the recorder's office. By doing so, the landowners agree not to develop the land for at least the duration of the covenant length and time enrolled in the program. It is also important to include all portions of the covenant, which includes Exhibit A and B. When you actually have the covenant itself printed out, you can see what those exhibits consist of, but just for your reference, Exhibit A is the legal description that encompasses all the forest land that the claimant wishes to enroll. And then Exhibit B, this is the map of the land. In many cases, we see the map being taken right from the forest management plan itself. And so that is something that you can use as a reference. Copies of property tax statements also need to be sent. And this is used to determine if delinquent taxes are owed on the property or not. Some other things that the applicant is verifying is that the parcel is not enrolled in 2C, managed forest land, or enrolled in any other program such as, you can see, Green Acres, Rural Preserve, or Egg Preserve. The 2C classification and those programs result in a tax benefit already. And so if the parcel has any of those programs, or if they're enrolled in that classification, it would not qualify for SFAA. Other situations where the land would also not qualify is if it was enrolled in CRP, CREP, or RIM. As I mentioned earlier, that SFAA land also can be enrolled in a conservation easement. It just results in a reduced payment, but they are still receiving a payment. And so what you would have to do if you have land in the conservation easement is just send that documentation to us at the time of application. All right, so once applications are submitted, the first step of verification review process begins. I just want to give a visual of what that process looks like and the details that go into it. So once we receive the application, we do a first couple initial checks. We make sure that the map is there, that the covenant's recorded and included, and also that that map is legible. The Department of Natural Resources is mapping this, and so mapping lands that are enrolled in SFAA. So it's really important to have a legible map to see exactly what land is enrolled in the program. And then once we have the initial checks of that application, the information from the application and the supporting documents are actually entered into our tax system. this is how we calculate and issue those incentive payments that I talked about, and also how we transfer the information to DNR so that they are able to do their verification. So part of, again, the other verification and things that we're looking at are the current tax statements to see what that classification of the property is, if there's any delinquent taxes. We're making sure that the ownership of the land is actually the person who is applying to be enrolled in the program. That's important. Making sure that the land is not exempt. Exempt land does not qualify for SFA. And so that would be one. And then we're also making sure that the acres that are on the tax statement are matching up to the acres that they are trying to enroll as well. And so after Julie, as you had heard from earlier, after she verifies all these things, then that process moves over to DNR to do their review. So after DNR goes and reviews some of the things that they're looking for enrollment into the program, they communicate back to us of what the decision would be of approval into the program, denial for any reasons, and then there may also be some things where an adjustment to the original application is made. This may be that maybe 40 or 80 acres were put on the application and maybe 74 actually qualify, and so that would be an adjustment to that original application. And so this is the point where you would hear back from us as what the decision is. And we would let you know no matter what, and at this current process it is through mail, snail mail, so you'd receive that decision. And so if it's approval, you're going to get that information on the program, some additional things to be aware of, and then also what your next steps are to receive that incentive payment. Now, if you had a denial or a denial of any acres or a complete denial, we also send that with some appeal options that you have. And so we'll move into those now. Okay, so I want to go over some of these common issues that may cause denial of the application to try and prevent those in the forefront, because a lot of times it may just be some missing information or missteps. And so reminder to go through that checklist on the application. Some of the things that we see are maybe the covenant's not sent with the application or it's unrecorded. This does need to have that recorded in the county. And then also the application itself, sometimes it's missing information that we do not have. Again, that claimant needs to be an owner of the property or an authorized representative if it's owned by an entity. And that forest management plan needs to be registered. And again, I've already kind of shared what we're looking for on that tax statement and what that means as well. So your right to appeal, everybody has the right to appeal, and sometimes what it just means is after that denial, giving us the information that we're telling you that you're missing, and then we review that information and then enroll you into the program. So it's more of just a communication of, hey, we don't have everything we need right now to enroll you into the program. You need to provide more proof, and that's exactly what it is. It's up to you to provide the proof to us. And so with that corrected action that's necessary. All right, so once enrolled into the program, usually around May, so right now is really our busy season of when we sent out certification forms. So we send out at each participant in the SFA program a certification letter. This starts with the year after the participant has been approved for enrollment. So what this is that the claimant must sign a certification letter attesting that the requirements and conditions for continued enrollment in the program are being met. So this is just verifying that you are still following the requirements and you are subject to receive an incentive payment. So they must sign the certification letter and send back to revenue by July 1st of that same year in order to receive that incentive payment. Now, if the claimant does not return the certification letter by the due date, they will not receive that incentive payment for that year. So on the certification letter, there are multiple things the landowners are certifying on this form. Some of the things are certifying that they've not improved the land, such as adding roads, buildings, cell towers, billboards, electricity, things like that. Again, it's verifying a lot of things that they're verifying when they're making initial enrollment, such as the classification of the land is not 2C, and also that none of the land is enrolled in those programs that we talked about. And they're also completing a Woodland activity annual report, which is sent over to DNR. And so this report is reporting any woodland activities completed on that enrolled land. The purpose of this report is so for DNR to learn more about the claimant's woodland activities and to see really if the SFA program is successful in meeting one of its purposes, which is to encourage sustainable forest management of privately owned woodlands. I do want to talk just briefly about the impact if a landowner does not stay in compliance with the program and or covenant, just so that you have all the education. And just to inform you that if there's a violation in place, there are penalties and interest that could apply. And so at a minimum, there's going to be a payback of SFA that's received plus interest for the number of years of the covenant length of half that length. So either a 4, 10, or 25, whichever is less. And really, when we talk about violations, it could be due to a change of the use of the land was developed, a house was built, etc. So just keep in mind when you are enrolling into this program, you are enrolling and promising to really sustain and follow your forest management practices, staying in compliance with the program, and then you won't have an issue with being in violation. Just some other quick reminders about the certification form, because this is really what triggers that initial incentive payment, is that certification letters are mailed to the address that we have on file with us. So like I said, we put it into our tax system. That address that's provided to us is where we're sending that certification letter. We have some participants who tend to move during the winter, and so in May, maybe they haven't chosen to come back yet. And so that certification form. So we really try to tell everyone we can that if you're not receiving a certification letter by May 15th, to give us a call, because we want to make sure that you get that and you can get it back to us by July 1st. And then that is about, and then after you complete your certification form and found in compliance, our tax system will then process your payments to be sent out in October 1st. Okay, so I went through a lot of some of those steps. Good news is we have these steps on the application itself and some of our fact sheets. We do hear some questions time to time about the timeline from when a property owner starts the process of enrolling in SFA and when they actually receive their first payment. So we created a little visual for you. The entire process itself takes a full calendar year from application to receiving that first payment. So just for review, you can see here that the property owner starts the process, and then that SFA application is submitted on October 31st. Then the property owner is notified of the application status, and like I said, that would be from revenue that we would share that with you via mail. And then if approved, a certification letter is then sent that following year by May 1st. Then you want to complete that certification letter and is sent back to revenue by July 1st. So you have that 2-month window, and then it gives us time to review, also verify with DNR, make sure you're still in compliance, and then that incentive payment is issued out on October 1st. All right, so now you know the basics of the programs, how it works, what needs to be done before making application, the verification and approval process and what that looks like, and next steps after you're actually enrolled in the program. So now we want to talk a little bit more about the land eligibility piece. So like I said at the beginning, role my team plays and is working really closely with the county assessors and the property classification of property. And so this is another big role that as a department, revenue plays with the SFA administration. So I'm going to let Jessie Clancy speak a little bit to that.
All right, thanks, Emily. That was really informational. I hope everybody was able to learn something. If you do have questions throughout this presentation, I've noticed some of you have put through questions on the chat. Feel free to send those in as we're talking. We will go over those at the end, just a reminder, if you have questions after Emily's portion. So like Emily said, there's a lot that goes into this program. As you know, that it starts with the property owner or the landowner. They start putting together all those documents, all those maps and things like that that you need to package up and send off with your application. The other side of this program, the important factors that fall into this program, are things that are a little out of the property owner's control, but very important for the property owner to understand. We're going to discuss two of those factors. One is classification of property, and the other thing we're going to look at is assessment year versus payable year. We are starting to talk a little bit into the weeds of our language that us property tax administrators spend a lot of time on, but we just thought it would be really important to give you a good high-level representation of what this is so that you have a good idea. So let's first look at classification and how it affects the SFIA program. For those of you that are not familiar, in Minnesota, we have over 60 classifications that property assessors use on an annual basis when they classify the property. Classification is solely based on the use of the property, and it is determined by the assessor. And they are simply looking at how the property is currently used. We have a date that the statutes require for an assessor to determine the classification on an annual basis, and that date is January 2nd. So every January 2nd, assessors are determining the classification of property based on the use of that property. There are, like I said, a lot of classifications. There are some that are based on other factors, but most of them are strictly based on use. The assessor sets that classification based on how the property is being used. The owner is using their property in January, then the assessor would classify that property as residential. It's how the property is being used, so that's how it's classified. After January 2nd, the classification cannot be changed by the assessor unless the property owner goes through an appeal process. In the state of Minnesota, property owners have the right to appeal their classification for the current assessment year. That appeal process happens between the months of April and all the way through June. When a landowner wants to enroll into SFIA, they must verify the classification of their property with the county assessor. Emily touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but this is a super important step and probably one of the first ones that you want to do. Because as you saw in the previous slide, it does take a full calendar year from application to payment. And so we need to make sure that your property is classified correctly before you start jumping into getting all of the other stuff taken care of for your application. So talking to your assessor, looking at your statements and valuation notices to figure out what your classification is a really great thing to do if you're interested in enrolling into SFIA. The property, if you want to enroll into SFIA, the property must be used as a forest. That's what this program is all about. It's about sustaining forest. So there are a few classifications that the assessor has when it comes to classifying property that is used as a forest. The most common classification that is out there for forest land is typically 2B, also known as rural vacant land. This is the classification that you want if you want to get into SFIA. This tells the assessor and the Department of Revenue and the DNR that the property simply is rural in nature, it's unplatted, there's no structures or any sort of roads, things like that, that would make your property not qualify. The other very popular classification for forest land in Minnesota is classification 2C, also known as managed forest land. On this next slide, we're going to look at the difference between the two. Now, when you look, if you were to be standing out on the road and you were looking at a forest or you were looking at a piece of property, by the eye, you would not know that one is 2B and one is 2C. They look and feel the same. They look like trees, they look like a forest. However, in the world of property tax, they are very different. They have similar requirement or similar characteristics, but their requirements are very different. So that's what we're going to look at now. So when it comes down to the actual taxation of these two classifications, our 2B rural vacant land has a class rate of 1%. These class rates are used when county auditors and treasurers are calculating the taxes you'll be paying. 1% is a very common class rate for a lot of classifications in the state. So this is not necessarily a tax benefit. 1% is something that's very standard. However, when you look at 2C, managed forest land, you'll see that the class rate is lower. It is at 0.65. So when your property is classified as 2C, managed forest land, you are receiving a tax benefit. And if you remember a few slides back, Emily had talked a little bit about that. If you want to be an SFIA, you can't also be in 2C. And this is why. You can't get an incentive payment, but also get a tax benefit with the 0.65 class rate that comes with 2C. The next thing we'll look at is what is required. So when you have 2B rural vacant land, this is defined as unimproved rural land, and it does not have a current forest management plan. A plan is not required. You might have this plan and still be 2B. However, you're not required to get a plan to have the classification of 2B. That is different for our 2C managed forest land properties. To be in class 2C managed forest land, or to have that classification applied to your property, you do have to have a current forest management plan that you would submit to the assessor's office along with an application for your property to be classified as 2C. Another difference between these two, 2B rural vacant land has no minimum acreage requirement to be classified as this. So there are properties out there that are 1 acre in size and they're rural in nature and they're classified as 2B. Same goes for 40-acre parcels or 180-acre parcels. There's no minimum acreage. It's just how it's being used. The assessor will classify it as 2B. For 2C managed forest land, there is a requirement. For a property to be classified as 2C, the property itself must have 20 acres or more for the property to be classified as 2C. So the difference between these two, we've already talked about this one a little bit. 2B would be allowed in an SFIA. So if you were to call your assessor and say, what is the classification of my property? I'm interested in the SFIA program. If they told you 2B, you'd be set to go. You could start that process. Your property would at that point be eligible for the next steps to get that process moving to go into SFIA. If they tell you that your classification is 2C, you would need to work through that process with them to get it changed over to 2B before you would be allowed to be enrolled into SFIA. We're going to look at that a little closer in the next slide here, but just so you know, it does take a little while for that classification to be changed over. So 2B is the yes, and 2C, you would need to have a few things happen before you could enroll. The 2B rural vacant land, This is just a classification that the assessor determines on January 2nd based on the use. You don't have to apply, you don't have to provide any documentation. The assessors are simply just looking at the current use. If it's being used as woods and it's unimproved and rural, they're going to classify it 2B. If your property is classified as 2C, you've gone through a process with the assessor. You've provided an application, a copy of your forest management plan. You've had verification that you have 20 acres or more, and you do all of that by May 1. And then I touched on this a little bit, but another good reminder, the 2B does not have a tax benefit. So when you're classified as 2B, there's no special class rate. You're strictly 1%. This is why you would be allowed into SFIA. If you have 2C, you are receiving a tax benefit with that lower 0.65 class rate, meaning that you would not also be able to receive an SFIA incentive payment until those classifications were changed. Okay, so outside of classification, now that we kind of understand the two different types of classifications based on forest use, the other factor that's extremely important in the administration of SFIA is knowing the difference between an assessment year and a payable year. In the previous slides, I stated that assessors set the classification of property on an annual basis, which is on January 2nd every year. Now, assessors, even though they wish they did, they do not have a magical crystal ball where they can look at every property on January 2nd and set that classification on that day. So assessors will do a lot of their assessment work, or what we say field work, in the months prior to January 2nd. Typically, this is sometime between the summer and the super cold winter months. They are doing their best to set those classifications and find out that current use. So, for example, let's say a property in 2019 was used as a residential property for most of the year. However, in November of 2019, the assessor was notified that the property was recently converted over to a hair salon, and the owner was now using the property for a business purpose. On January 2nd of 2020, the assessor would then classify the property according to the use, which at that time, based on the information they were provided, the classification would now be commercial. No longer would it be residential. That was all based on that conversation back in November. Now that the classification would be set, the assessor cannot make any changes for that assessment year. So in this example that I just mentioned, it would be the commercial classification on the hair salon would be for the 2020 assessment. So January 2nd, 2020, it is set as commercial for the 2020 assessment year. The only way classification could be changed at that point would be through the appeal process. So why is this important for you to understand when we're talking about SFIA? It's important to understand that if the assessor has your land classified anything other than 2B, so let's say they have it classified as 2C on January 2nd, they cannot change that classification to 2B until the next January 2nd. So we will, on the next slide, we're going to have a visual for this, but it's just a reminder that if you are classified as 2C on January 2nd, they would not be able to change it until the following January 2nd. Now let's shift over and look at payable year. On January 2nd, 2020, assessors set the classifications for their 2020 assessment year. Those classifications and values begin the process for the taxes payable year. And what that means is exactly what it sounds like. A taxes payable year is the year that the taxes are due. It is the year that property owners are paying their taxes. So the 2020 classifications that were set during the 2020 assessment year would be paid in 2021. The SFIA program is administered in the payable year, meaning that the land must be correctly classified in the payable year to be approved for SFIA. This is why your tax statements are required with your application to verify that you do not have delinquent taxes and that your property is correctly classified for that payable year. Okay, so now we're going to look at a visual. We're going to start on January 2nd, 2020. We'll pretend that the land that you own was classified as 2C on January 2nd, 2020. Then in August of 2020, you decide you're interested in this SFIA program and you want to know how to get things started. You contact your assessor and they tell you you are classified as 2C. You ask them to change it to 2B. That is something that they can put a note in their system. However, that will not change until January 2nd of 2021. On January 2nd of 2021, the assessor would change your classification from 2C to 2B. So between August and January of 2021, you, the landowner, would not be doing anything yet for the SFIA program. You would simply be waiting for that classification change. In May of 2021, your property taxes that you're going to be paying would be based on your 2C classification from the January 2nd, 2020 assessment year. So this is where our assessment year and our payable year start to kind of communicate. So in May of 2021, you're paying your 2C taxes, benefiting from your 0.65 class rate. In October of 2021, you would then apply for SFIA. In January of on January 2nd, 2022, your property again would be classified as 2B. In May of 2022, your taxes you are going to be paying would be based on your 2B classification, which again has that class rate of 1%, so no tax benefit at that point. However, a few months later, you would complete your certification form, and by October of 2022, you would have your first SFIA incentive payment. So as you see on the screen, it does take a little while. You had interest in August of 2020, and you did not get your payment until October of 2022. This has to do with assessment year and payable years. You have to wait until the property is correctly classified, and then you move through the process of applying for SFIA. Now remember, when you paid your taxes in May of 2021, you're still receiving a benefit. You're still getting 0.65 if your property is classified as 2C. And then when you pay your taxes in May of 2022, you're no longer getting a benefit from the classification, but then you're getting your incentive payment in that same year. One other thing we want to mention on this slide here, and something to think about, we often find landowners kind of going back and forth on, should I be 2C or should I be in the SFIA program? Both of them have their benefits, as we just saw. One thing to know about SFIA is the incentive payment that you receive, it is taxable income. So at the end of every year that you have received an incentive payment, you would receive a 1099 that would be included in your taxes for the following year. So keep that in mind. If SFIA is something that you're thinking about, it is something that you would have to report as taxable income. If you want to go down the 2C route, that is just a lower tax classification rate, and that would not be something that you would have to worry about for income taxes. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about resources. So Emily talked about our website a little bit and how helpful it is. And so we're going to do a little bit of a live demo to show you how to find this information, plus a lot more on our website. The first thing I want you to note is our web address. It's www.revenue.state.mn.us. When you get to our homepage, this is what it looks like. The best way to navigate to our SFIA homepage is by typing in SFIA in the search bar. Now I'm going to share my screen to give you a live tour of our website. So if I go up to the search bar and I type in SFIA, oops, you'll see that at the very top, I get a keyword result and I get the Sustainable Forest Incentive Act. If I click on that link, I am taken directly to the homepage for SFIA. This is a great resource, something you can maybe put in your bookmarks or find a spot in your computer to save this so that you can get there directly through a quick link, or like I said, just to the homepage and type in SFIA. You'll see in the page at the very top, we kind of go into a brief explanation of what the program is. And then down towards the middle of the page, there are these 4 boxes. Each box has a plus sign. This expands to give you more information based on the topic that you're looking for. So here's a payment rate table. This is the exact same one you saw in our slides earlier in this presentation. This payment rate table changes on a yearly basis depending on what the new rates are for each year. So this is an important page to go to every year if you are in the program so that you know what your payment will be based on. I can click on this next box here, the next plus sign. It says who qualifies for the payment. This is where it will go through all of those requirements. The same information we shared with you today is right here on our website and easy for you to navigate to. It goes into what what you can be on the property or how the property qualifies. Then it goes into those situations that we talked about where they can't have these situations happen and be in SFIA. The next one is super important for those of you that might be interested in enrolling into the program. How do I enroll? Here is your application, and here is a copy of those 3 different types of covenants that you would open and print off along with your application once you start that process. If I open this application, the checklist we had talked about is right on the top. So this helps you walk through the checklist to make sure you have everything you need to enroll into SFIA. The due date is also at the top, so you have that right away. And then it goes into some information that you need to provide. The very last page is instructions on how to apply, what kind of information you need, due dates, so forth and so on. And then our last box here is resources. Right now we have 2 pretty important documents that if you're interested or want to know more about the program, we would really recommend that you check out. This first one is our fact sheet. This is the SFIA fact sheet, and it simply goes over what the program is. It talks about what we talked about today, and it might give you a little bit more context to understanding exactly what the program is, how you enroll, what do I do if I want to remove. And then at the very bottom of this fact sheet is our contact information, our direct email, our direct phone line, as well as the DNR's website on finding some information that the DNR provides. The last link is our frequently asked questions document. This again is a very helpful document for anyone that's either in the program or interested in getting in the program. Again, these are questions that we're receiving from landowners just like yourself. So when we get those questions submitted and they become more of a frequent question, we will update this document so that we can hopefully help landowners get to know the program a little bit better and not have to contact us directly. They can find their answer right on the website. So that's about it. Again, at the very bottom, we have our contact information. If you have questions, we also have the DNR's contact information for them if you have questions about your plans. And again, just a reminder, it's the Department of Revenue's homepage, search SFIA. And with that, I will turn it back over to Nicole, and we could possibly start the question and answer feature.
Great. Thank you guys so much for all that information. Can you all hear me? I believe so. All right. Perfect. I got a yes in the comment box. So if you haven't done so, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. I know we do have a few. I will start moderating. And then also Andy and John are on the line, so they feel free to unmute you guys to answer some of these questions. So the first one is there a definition as to what constitutes a forest?
Yep, this is Andy. Basically, it needs to be 10% stocked with trees, which can be a light amount of trees. So we definitely take a look at that and work with you, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a lot of trees in a single area.
Okay, perfect. Must the SFI forester be a Minnesota DNR forester?
So we've got two different kinds of foresters. We've got our DNR foresters, which is, we have 18 positions around the state, and they're good first contact to go through to kind of delve into the programs. And then we also have a long list of private consultant foresters that also can write these plans to be eligible for SFIA. And that can be found on the U of M website. Probably the easiest is to just Google U of M stewardship plan writers. I think if we're sending out more information, we can definitely get you a link for that.
Yeah, I can send the people who attended today that link as well.
Perfect.
Are out-of-state owners, but they own Minnesota property, eligible for the program?
Yes. Right.
Another question is, what types of maps are acceptable to be submitted?
They basically are pretty, they can be pretty simple. We'll need to know your parcel lines, which can be found on most county websites. And then the big one is the exclusions, to make sure those are on there. A lot of times when you get that stewardship plan written, working with that stewardship plan writer, you can create a map and just use the one they create for you. That is required on those stewardship plans.
Mm-hmm. Also, one that is relevant to what I just asked, Nancy just asked, is she lives in Minnesota but owns a wooded plot in Wisconsin. Can she apply?
Just for land in Minnesota. It's just a Minnesota program.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then this one we might have just answered it, but are the classification definition documents available to be consulted online? And I think you just showed that to us, Jesse.
Yeah, if they're looking for more information on classifications in general, they can go to our website as well and look for more information on classification. One thing that you can search for on our website is property tax administrators. When you get to that home page, you can find more information in general about classification. We have manuals out there and fact sheets. So if that's something they're looking into is the basic definitions of classifications, they can find more information there.
Perfect. This also kind of talks about the timeline that you showed, but can you enroll your SFIA on a 50-year covenant if your township's 20-year comprehensive plan changes your property zoning to residential? I know that's a little complicated.
Yeah, I can try to answer that one. Zoning does not have an effect on classification of property for property tax use. It is something the assessors use for property that does not have a current use. However, if you have a residential property, in like my example earlier, and it's changed over to a hair salon that's being used commercially, that's something that an assessor will classify as commercial, even though it's zoned as residential. So when it comes to enrolling your SFIA on a 50-year covenant, if your township's 20-year comprehensive plan changes your zoning, again, the program is basically based on your classification of property. So I don't believe that the zoning would affect anything unless the recorder's office was not able to record the covenant due to it. And that part I'm not sure about, but I can tell you that the classification would not be affected based on zoning.
Perfect. Next question, we're at 2:30, but I think we can squeeze in one more. Are there specific geographic areas where the SFI program is permitted? I know it says some Minnesota counties have very limited forest coverage.
Yeah, so it's permitted anywhere in the state with those counties with limited forest coverage. I'm not sure if it was touched on, but it's just got to be 20 acres of continuous forest to be in the program, with some exceptions like right-of-ways. So that's the big thing. So if there are 20 acres of wooded land in southern Minnesota, it's definitely allowed in the program.
Perfect. And then one more question, which I could probably answer. So it's about Wisconsin, and does Wisconsin have a program like this? So Wisconsin has managed forest law, and I'm hoping to do a webinar on that in a few months. So, all right, well, that concludes all the questions. I do have a quick survey that I'm gonna drop in the chat box for those who attended. If you could just take a quick moment and answer some of those questions, it'll help us figure out topics for the future. But once again, I want to thank our presenters. Thank you for your time. So that concludes today's webinars. Thank you.